Everybody, croeso yn arw iawn I noson hydref o'r Cymdeithas Hanes Rhyddlan. Welcome to our October meeting of the Local History Society in Rhyddlan. Hello Sarah, didn't see you there.
I'm quiet.
You are quiet, yes. You're allowed to sit there. Welcome to Oni, and her husband's gone to have a little read on the settee, so we mustn't forget him when it's cup of tea time. Islyn, would you like to introduce yourself when you're ready?
Yes.
And tell us a little bit about yourself. I could do it, but you know,
I'll do it.
I've only talked to Islyn on the phone and emails and so on, and it's been nice to meet her tonight. She lives in Rowen, would you believe? It's a beautiful place, isn't it? It's a bit of a distance to come, but the only connection I've got with Rowen, two things. My husband's mother used to love being taken up there to the pub for a lunch, for a little ride.
What's the name of the pub?
I don't remember. It's on the left-hand side as you go up. Right? And when my father, but this is only verbal, I've got no proof. When my father was very young and his younger sister was born, he was sent to stay with his nine in Rowen. And that's all I know. I know when it was, but I don't know where she lived. No.
Right.
So, and I know her name. So one day, Sarah, we'll look for Sarah's
Hunt her down.
We'll hunt her down. Sarah's our researcher. Now, Islyn has got a lot of stuff to show us here, and hopefully you can all see.
I'm here too.
If you don't hear, just put your hand up and we'll ask her to shout. Oh, thank you very much indeed.
Diolch am y croeso. Dwi'n dysgu Cymraeg, ond heno dwi'n siarad yn Saesneg.
Iawn,
Right, so, well, very, very nice to be here. It's an honour and a privilege to come and talk to a historical society. I'm not a historian, I have to say, and my training was in science, but when I came back to Wales from a long spell in Scotland, my husband and I met up there, and we stayed there and brought up our children in Aberdeen, just outside Aberdeen, and lived there for nearly 30 years. But we inherited a small farm just outside Rowen. We both had studied agriculture, and we came back to do some practical farming for 20 years. So I'm obviously getting on, and we had to give up when we got to 70 or so. Well, I gave up then because the work with the sheep got a bit hard on the back. But it was a lovely way of settling in to the community of Rowen. My aunt had lived there for many years, and she had farmed and had established a very nice garden. So when we got there, 14 years after she died, we had quite a lot of work to do, especially with the garden. And the garden is open under the National Garden Scheme, so I'm just saying that in case anybody is keen on gardening, and you'll always be very welcome to come and see the garden at any time. So, to go back to my interest really in my great-grandfather, I realised when I came back to Wales that we had all rather taken it for granted as children that he had done a lot. And my father used to say, it's a pity you don't speak Welsh, because if you read the Cofiant, the biography of your great-grandfather, you'd know a lot. So when I came back and I realised how ignorant I was really about the family and Welsh history, I had gone to Welsh classes, and I started, with the help of a very good friend, to translate the biography, which was written by T. Gwyn Jones, who worked in the press in Denbigh with my great-grandfather. They overlapped. T. Gwyn Jones was a very young man who went on to become a professor of English, I think, at Aberystwyth University, one of the very early first appointments that was made. And he wrote this very interesting life story. And the thing that is perhaps worth pointing out, it's a great help to me because, as I say, I'm not a historian, but the dates of Victoria, Queen Victoria and Thomas G, were very similar. So he was really a Victorian publisher and printer. And during his life, there were huge changes in Wales, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with that idea. And I'll just go through some of the points. In 1770, most people were involved in farming. The Vale of Clwyd has always been a very fertile place, and by the time we come to 1851, people in farming had fallen to a third of the population. 500,000 people in Wales in 1770, over 1 million by 1851. The politics, again, changed very radically, and we'll see that Thomas G had a big part to play in the changes in. He was a radical liberal, and things changed very much during his lifetime. From squires and tenants in the 1770, the voice of the people was being heard by 1851. No Welsh periodicals in 1770, but by 1851, lots of printers and lots of Welsh publications. By 1851, 80% of Welsh people were attending nonconformist chapels. It's said, isn't it, that one was built every 8 days between 1800 and 1850. And of course that's a bit of a problem for us chapel goers today. So many chapels now are closing in the country. Travel in 1770, someone said, I've never heard of anyone travelling in Wales for pleasure. I'm not sure it wasn't Dr. Johnson. But anyway, by 1850, it was a hugely popular place to come to. At the time of when people were very interested in the art of the picturesque, they were coming to the Wye Valley, they were coming to Snowdonia, and I know in Betws-y-Coed, I think the first school of painting anywhere in Britain was David Cox and his fellow artists who set up, and there are a lot of houses there that are known to have been lived in by his group of painters. So it was a time of great change. Here I've written his achievements, but I'll get back to those perhaps at the end of my talk. Just to say that his whole life was lived in Denbigh, apart from a brief spell in London. And he, I've said that there were enormous changes during his lifetime, but he was born and brought up by his father, who was Thomas G, and his mother, who was Mary Fowkes. Thomas G, the first Thomas G, came from Chester, and he was a printer journeyman, and he came to work with William Collister Jones, I think rings a bell, and then with the Reverend Thomas Jones in Ruthin, first of all. And the Reverend Thomas Jones was one of the very first Methodists, and they worked together on producing religious books, purely theological, and books for tracts for people to read. And then the Reverend Thomas Jones retired from printing and sold the press to my great-great-grandfather in 1812. And he then moved to Denbigh and started printing. And he stuck to religious works and dictionaries. Owen Pugh's Welsh English Dictionary was produced at that time, around about that time. And he was a very upright man. He married Mary Fowkes and learnt Welsh, fluent Welsh, and was a very good man. They brought up their family of 5 surviving children, and Thomas G, this one, the one I'm really going to be talking about, was his eldest son. He had 2 younger brothers. One was Robert G, who was also quite had a very interesting life. Robert became a doctor. He studied in Freiburg and then in London, and moved to Liverpool, worked there in the cholera epidemic, and became a very he married an heiress, and they had no children, and they gave all their money to the Liverpool Medical Department. So they were, unfortunately, as I had no children, nobody really knows about Robert G. But in the Liverpool, the Mount Pleasance, where they have a little museum, there is a great deal about him and what he did for the university. As far as schooling went, they seem to have, all the children had a good schooling, and Thomas went to Grove Park when he was 11 as a boarder, Grove Park, Wrexham. He was very homesick at first, but sort of got used to it, came back at 14, and was then apprenticed to his father half a day, which is quite interesting, and the other half a day he spent at school. And he stayed there for, I think, until he was 18. Whether that was common or not, I don't know, but it sounds quite a modern idea, doesn't it, to have a sort of half day of work and a half day of learning. And he learnt, actually, Latin, Greek, and he taught himself Hebrew. I think he was a very clever boy, because the story goes that he learnt by heart his Latin textbook. And on the strength of that, he recited it. I don't know how that was organised, but he recited it, I think, in front of the rest of the school. And they all got a day's holiday. So I think it was probably quite popular. And then he worked with his father until 1822. And then he had to play his part then in the firm. And I've just got some notes here about this, what he did when he was 22 years old, sorry, he was a bit, yes, I said that, didn't I? 22 years old, in May of 1837, he went to London. This was to gain experience, the latest printing techniques, because up until that time, according to one of my reference books here, nothing had changed really in the printing techniques. That somebody said that Gutenberg in Germany invented the printing press and the type molds in the 1440s, and William Caxton in 1470 was printing in Westminster. That actually very little changed, thank you, very little changed for 300 years. It was really a sort of craft occupation. There was very little in the way of mechanisation. And I'm sure you all know the principles behind printing. It's a bit like taking a fingerprint, isn't it? You've got the ridges, and the ridges pick up the ink, and the spaces in between don't pick up the ink. And I've brought some bits for you to see later on that show the type. And the type was made in, they were all hand carved in wood, the actual letters and all the punctuation. Everything was carved in wood making a mould, a type mould, and then the lead alloy was molten and poured into the moulds. So apparently they could do this very, very quickly. And I don't know if you've seen a compositor's tray, but they're about, I actually have one which I couldn't bring because I got all my thimbles in it. So anyway, it's about that big. And before I came tonight, I counted up. There are 95 little slots, wooden partitions. And I think this is perhaps one of the most amazing things, was that they had their stick, as they called it. The compositor's tray was on a stand in front of them, and whatever they were printing, their copy was there, and they could, they were very, very dexterous and quick, remembering that they're doing everything in reverse into the stick, and laying it out, in picking up, putting it in, and I think that was called typesetting, at tremendous speed. And one of the stories was that they, in one of the big London presses where Thomas G went to observe and to work, they had 60 compositors. People were actually setting the type, the compositors, and they worked at tremendous speed, and they were so well coordinated between eye and hand. They used to hire a small boy to read the papers to them, the daily papers. They paid the boy to do that, so not only were they setting time, but they were hearing and keeping up to date with the news, which seems pretty incredible when you think they started work at 7 and worked on till 7 o'clock at night with an hour off in the middle of the day. No holidays, Sundays off, and Christmas Day. And that continued, I think, until the 1860s, when they changed the employment laws. So it was something, it was time of Dickens, of course. When he went to London, Dickens was writing up he was worked as a printer actually, didn't he? Or no, he was a printer, but he started off in a print works, and soon turned his hand to writing, and rather than making his money in other ways, shall we say. So the life of the working man was very miserable, and they did work 14, 16 or even 18 hours a day from their 7th birthday onwards, and it's quite incredible. So Thomas G is going as a young man from Denbigh, never having been very far afield, going to London. You can imagine what a change of life it was. And he I've got quite a bit about that actually, which I'll just find for you because it's out of the Coviant. And his father writes to him. He was strictly brought up. There were different times to now. Thomas has taken his own route to London. And this is the father's letter to him. I regret that you took such a circuitous route. It appears that Thomas had gone first to Liverpool, then to Hull, and by boat from Hull to London. As this caused you to travel on the Sabbath, I wish you had set off for Birmingham. You would then have avoided breaking the commandment. I am fully aware that if you set off by packet on Saturday, you must necessarily have been on your journey the following day. However, I hope it will be a lesson to you, and having made one bad step, you will above all things take a special care to observe this blessed day very circumspectly and reverently, and indeed let your conduct in all things be such as becometh those who profess to be followers of the Lord Jesus. Be sure to avoid all lightness of conversation, and rather observe a reserved disposition with the men in the office in which you may be placed. They will respect you more than if you make too free with them. I hope that you may get a comfortable position. In your next letter you will inform me where your lot is fixed, what kind of lodgings you are in, and all other particulars of your office, men, presses, etc. So he had no place arranged for him in advance, but in London he took work in the office of Messrs. Eyre and Spottiswoode, and soon proved himself in it by setting type very quickly. After that he moved to the office of Messrs. Gilbert and Company, but didn't appear to be at all happy at first. His father wrote to him at the beginning of June advising him to move to another place. He told him of an office where things were printed in Welsh for the government, and suggested that he would be able to earn the same amount through reading proofs. If it was known, he was able to do this. The typesetters, he said, are often going to the office where Abel Simner is to ask him about Welsh words that they're not able to read themselves in the handwriting. More was paid for printing Welsh, as it was considered a foreign language. His father asked him in his letters to take note of various printing matters. For example, the best way to letter the backs of books bound in cloth. I don't know if you know much about bookbinding, but that's obviously quite a tricky thing to do when you're pressing through the leather that binds the book together. Also, the way to make rollers and keep them soft and in good condition. That's the ink rollers now, putting the ink over the type. So at this time he was lodging in number 15 Dewan Crescent and was received into the Welsh Methodist Church and taught in Sunday school there, and that seemed to be a happy and friendly place where he got to know people. Letters could be sent through the post, but it was very expensive, and so every chance to send them was taken. Anyone going to London would carry a lot of letters. The penny post was started in 1840, but his family and friends wrote frequently, and various. It was really, London itself was, no doubt, I think, a culture shock to him. It was the London, as we were saying, the London of Dickens. There were 5,000 gin palaces. And listen to this, £3 million was spent on gin alone in London. 3 million. In those days, what would that be now? I mean, at this time, he became interested in the temperance movement, and that he was associated with that for the rest of his life. So that the next thing that happened was that he was called home. I think he was in London for about, or not quite 2 years. His mother became ill early in 1938, but before he returned home, we know that Mr. Bagot, who was the Denbighshire MP, gave permission to take him one morning to the House of Commons, and Lord Mostyn enabled him to attend some occasion in the House of Lords. He had also, by this time, become ordained as a Calvinistic Methodist minister. He had all his life, now talking up to this young man in his 20s, he had been a very, they had been brought up as church people, but when he was 15, he decided that he would join the Methodists, and in fact the rest of the family followed him, and eventually they were all members in Capel Mawr in Denbigh, the very big chapel which I'm sure you all know, and which is very near to the Gwasg G building, the G Press building. I've got a couple of pictures of that. That's a sort of aerial view. Are you familiar with the building?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's a lovely street, isn't it, with Capel Mawr and then this building and then the other lovely chapel.
Swan Lane.
Yes, yes. So the that's another picture of it. But anyway, he is now. He wrote to his parents asking if their permission to become a minister, and he was actually ordained in London, and throughout his life. I'm just going to mention this now because I think it's important that we know the background really to what he did. He preached every Sunday, frequently 3 times, and very often in 3 different places, travelling on horseback and occasionally having accidents en route. We think of people riding on horseback, but we forget that sometimes horses take fright at things, and there are stories about him falling off when the horse shied, but he was never injured, and he continued doing that until he died. When he was 83 years of age, he was able to get on and off his horse, which I always think is pretty impressive. It's interesting for me going to chapel in Rowen because he actually preached there, and there's a story in the Covenant. At the time the church, the church tax, which of course he was very much opposed to, the bailiffs came to his house in Denbigh, and he was preaching. He was away from home, which they knew he would be, and the boy from his house, the boy that helped them with the horse, I suppose, came over and came into the chapel, the chapel where I go, and Thomas G was preaching, and he saw the boy and he thought, oh, somebody must be ill at home. So when they were all singing a hymn, they had a bit of a chat, and the boy said, no, the bailiffs have come in to take your furniture, because he was refusing to pay the church tax as a nonconformist. And so he said, well, we'll go back now. And so after the service had finished, he went back to Denbigh, which meant travelling back in the dark to be there in time for the to face up to the people who were coming. Anyway, that was just one of quite a few episodes in those days of the very strong feelings, really, I suppose you would say. One of the very important things in his life was his marriage to Susanna, who was a farmer's daughter. This is them both actually in middle age, but she was a very pretty girl apparently, and she was also had the benefit of a very good education. And she was one of 3 daughters. They all went to school, and she seemed to be very much part of the whole, all his work really, and his achievements. They had 8 children, so she was pretty busy at home, and I imagine a very well organised person. She was also a Sunday school teacher, and we have actually her wedding dress, which is lovely. They were married in October, and it's a lovely apricot brocade. I don't know when people started wearing white wedding dresses, but I don't think they had them in 1845, which is when they were married. They wrote a covenant in which they made a promise that they would tithe all their goods to God, and this they kept to all their lives, and it followed. I know that the next generation also were very conscientious in that respect. His mother, after his mother died in 1938, aged 56, it affected all the family very seriously, and her husband never got over it. He died at his doctor's son's house in Liverpool in 1845, and that was really the time. That was the time when Thomas and Susanna got married. I think there'd been an understanding between them while he was in London, but he was now in the position really of being in charge of the press. So the next thing really was, he's now a married man in charge of the printing press in Denbigh, probably the major employer in the town. There were a lot of people worked in the Gwask, and he had inherited, his father did a lot of jobbing printing, printed dictionaries. Thomas G continued to do that, and to produce religious books. That went on all the time. Books for Sunday school, Bibles, and had a lot of work with the aristocracy. That was what printers did, apparently. They did a lot of prepared stationery and visiting cards and all those sort of special things. But it all came to an end because of his politics. So I must just find the right bit in my notes about what happened next. The trouble was that the paper in the politics took over really, and I'm trying to find the date of when he started his newspaper. I think it was actually, I've changed the date here, but I got it wrong. It is actually 1857. In 1857, apparently the tax on newspapers, I think, was moved so that it was actually I really want the date of the election. I think it was sometime in 1850. Swivel notes, I must get this right. Yes, in 1857 he switched completely from really to survive. He produced in his press they produced the Vanner. Now this started in 1857. And in 1859, it was combined with the Amserai. And from then on, the title of the paper was the Vanner ac Amserai Cymru. This is not a very old one, but that's 1915. The Vanner kept going for quite a long time after it went out of our family. And he had very well-known and clever people involved in the paper. And I have a sheet about that here, which I might just read to you, because you'll be interested to know who the editorship was. The Reverend William Rees, John Hughes and Thomas Jones, with the Reverend John Roberts as sub-editor, a post which he held for 25 years. The first number comprised 12 pages measuring about 15 by 10 inches. On the first page was a declaration stating what its objectives and characteristics would be. It was to contain original articles on the political and religious upheavals of the day, home and foreign stories and news, motivation of kingdoms, societies and churches, sciences and the arts, the press and the literature, and reports on fairs, markets, etc. Among the aims was to give those who read it a source of general knowledge as pure and unbiased as possible, broadening the ideas and refining the tastes and feelings, particularly of the younger generation. It was also keep under surveillance the productions of the Welsh press. The paper was to be entirely non-sectarian in its spirit and utterances, but at the same time to be a banner for battle against all deceit, oppression, untruth, and ready to fight and avenge all cases of civic and ecclesiastical injustice and government oppression. It was to be in politics, loyal, liberal, and Christian. Now, he did write a great deal himself, and it's interesting to, just at this point, to remember that he was offered other jobs because he was clever. I think in those days, if people watched out for clever boys at school, and then they suggested they would help them financially and help them to study law or medicine or to go into the church. And this apparently happened to him. And he said no, he wanted to follow in his father's footsteps. He wanted to be a printer and publisher. And he stuck to that all his life. There were times later on in his life when he was offered the chance of becoming an MP, and he reckoned he could do more with his newspaper. He was really a media man. There is no doubt about it. He was able to use his position. He wasn't an editor, but he wrote articles for the paper, which were very, very influential in their day. He also, you'd be interested to know, that there was a London correspondent who wrote a London letter for the paper, and Yes. So it was a very, I mean, we take papers for granted, but it was actually the first newspaper in Wales. It was produced twice weekly, and my father told me when I was a child that he could remember, when he was a boy, that the paper used to be put up in the windows of shops, and the pages turned sort of during the day, so that people who couldn't afford to buy it, well, it wasn't very expensive, but they could share the reading of it, which is quite extraordinary, isn't it, to us these days? And there's so much written material about. Anyway, so what were his causes? Well, the paper really formed and enlightened opinion in its time on current issues. It expressed the viewpoint of radical and nonconformist Wales, and it fought the battles of Welsh democracy in education, religion, and in politics. So just to go into that for a little bit, I'd like just to say a bit about that on my right page. The first thing that he did after he was married actually was to ask people to give money, and he and his wife collected £100 and gave some, they contributed obviously, and they opened in 1845, just after they were married, a school that was built by the locals in Denbigh, free and non-denominational. There was this problem, you see, with the church schools, and the idea, Thomas G's idea, was that you taught your children their religion at home. You didn't teach it at school, and he felt that was very important. And this was the beginning, really, of his lifelong battle for education at primary, secondary and university levels. He had a lot to do with the establishing of the first University College of Wales, which was at Aberystwyth, and advocating all the way through the use of Welsh language in schools and in favour of Welsh as a university subject. He produced dictionaries and grammars, and then in 1854, it went on from 1854 to 1879, so it was a very long project, the first Welsh encyclopedia. I don't know whether you've heard about that, but it was a very big effort, and he called in a huge team of people, experts in different fields, to contribute. It came out I think they used to do this, it came out in magazine folio forms, and people collected them, paid bit by bit, and then it was 10 big volumes. A lot of people have copies of these to this day. You see them in chapels. I've seen them quite a lot round us, and I have 10 volumes too at home. It's very interesting. Maps, diagrams, all sorts of things. And if they didn't have somebody of their own as an expert, then somebody did the translation. So the science of the day was translated into Welsh. And so that was a huge achievement, really. It's supposed to have cost him £20,000 of his own money. But of course it would be spread, as we were saying, it would be spread out over a period of time, and presumably some money was coming back in to help him to finance it. And it's quite interesting because the second Welsh encyclopedia came out about 3 years ago, didn't it, I think? I don't know if any of you got a copy of that. A friend very kindly gave me, and it said, you know, it made a reference there, this is not the first, this is the second Welsh encyclopedia. So that was his next, really, gave huge status, really, I think, to Wales and the Welsh language, having their own encyclopedia. And it says here about 154 Welsh scholars and literary men contributed to the first edition. But he's best remembered, I think, for the paper, which we've been talking about here. And it was as I said, the first national Welsh paper. It had an educational role, explaining things to people, and there were letters, columns of letters. He was very interested in agricultural issues, having farmed for years at Eglwys Wen, some of you will know, outside Denbigh, the farm opposite the very old and beautiful church there. He was very enthusiastic about farmers' sons getting a proper farming education, agricultural education, and he supported its provision through the paper. In 1875, the tenants' rights measure, that was the political measure, that was explained in detail. And he argued that the games laws of 1880 ought to give farmers the right to kill any game and not just rabbits and hares. I can remember my mother telling me that her father, who farmed at Bachambid between Ruthin and in Llanrheadr, that he had to watch his corn being eaten by pheasants. It was very hard on people who were tenant farmers because the game laws prohibited them from killing anything except rabbits and hares. So pests were people had employed people as children as scarecrows, but they were very, very essential to save the harvest. He was very enthusiastic about agricultural shows and suggested a farmers' society for each county with a league for the whole of Wales. How many of these ideas were taken up, I don't know. Also proposed a land measure to secure reasonable rents and security of tenure. People didn't have security of tenure, and I'm sure you know that a lot of farmers were evicted because of their nonconformist beliefs, and that's when so many of them moved out to America, Canada, Patagonia. In his paper, he took a very radical line, saying that the landlords, criticising the landlords because of the open ballot. And this was when the tenants, when there was an election, the tenants were put into carts, taken down to wherever the votes were collected, and they had to, with a show of hands, they had to move into one place or another. There was no secret ballot. So if you were not voting for your landlord, you were pretty soon your position in your farm was threatened, and that was a very, very serious and unfair situation in his eyes and a lot of other people. But the paper gave him a vehicle to draw attention to it, and eventually there was a land reform. And I'm not suggesting that he was the only person, but he was certainly one of many champions for justice. And they also, this land measure was to secure reasonable rents, security of tenure, and compensation for improvements, because apparently if you improved you could spend a lot of money on improving your farm buildings, but you then had to, your rent then went up. It was all most unfair. And also a law to help farmers and farm workers buy their farms. Freedom to fish in the rivers, abolition of the game laws, abolition and reform of the House of Lords, disestablishment and disendowment of the church. Farmers opposed their workers belonging to these societies. So there was much debate, of course, and much unrest, wasn't there? It was a time of a lot of people moved from the land, went to work, as you know, in the mines, and moved to South Wales, moved to the cities. There was a huge emptying of the countryside. So he fought, really, through the paper. Just tell me, give me some idea of how long you have.
Oh, you've got another hour.
Some people going pale and fraught. No, seriously.
No, whenever.
Okay, well, I'll just finish this political bit. He fought for the political freedom of Wales, because of not only whether the oppressive landlords this was when he lost business, of course. Once he started pointing out that the landlords were not treating their tenants fairly, he lost his business and had to diversify, as they say these days. The tenant's right to vote according to his conscience. This was the thing he felt very strongly about. A secret ballot, which we all take for granted, and the naming and shaming now of vindictive landlords. So he was quite brave. He wasn't afraid of standing up for what he thought was right. In 1880, the Vanner called attention to the subject of tithes. And I expect some of you know about the tithe war, which took place in and around Denbigh and Llangwm, and there were lots of unpleasant happenings. And they brought the Lancers into Denbigh in 1888, and there's a photograph of them in the square. Thomas and his son Howell, my grandfather, were involved very much in this. And says Thomas G with his horse, which is called Degum, which is the Welsh for tithe. So it's a pretty strong symbol of revolt. And the end result was, I'm not going to go into the details of it, because if you're interested in the tithe war, there is a lot has been written about it. In 1896, there was a Royal Commission on Land in Wales, which helped to improve the relations between landlords and their tenants. Another thing was Home Rule. This was an ambition, and he had a lot to do with Gladstone. They were great liberals. They wrote to each other, they talked and visited, and I think that it didn't all work out very well, did it, with Ireland? And Thomas G's idea was that the four nations of the United Kingdom should have equal status, and worked for freedom, really, from England. He worked for the formation of a Welsh Nationalist Party and was the first president, actually, of the Cymru Fydd, which became Plaid Cymru eventually. He was also an early advocate of votes for women, and was very critical of Queen Victoria and the extravagance of the royal family, and her son, of course, who was Prince of Wales, was a sort of scandalous figure, and they were pretty disapproving in the Vanner of the goings-on of the Prince of Wales. So at one point there was a heading in the newspaper, "Is this a sovereignty or a democracy?" Question mark. The religious controversies, again, are complicated. The church tax, the problem with cemeteries. Of course, nonconformists were not allowed to be buried in cemeteries, in the church graveyards, so they had to build their own cemeteries. He had a lot to do with the formation of cemeteries in Denbigh. There was a lot of debate on disestablishment. They were all discussed in the newspaper. And so, to sum up, the newspaper was extremely important. Now, I haven't said anything about where we are really today with the press, and I think perhaps if I just finish with that. I just make sure I've just gone through all the achievements here. Yes, Welsh. Through the paper, he was able to support the young Welsh politicians, people like Lloyd George, Osborne Morgan, T. Ellis. Anybody that was interested and liberal, I suspect, got a lot of backing from the paper. They were able to change the whole way. The power, they took away really the power of the landlords, who just went back to Parliament almost unchallenged year after year, until the Welsh Liberals began to exert some power. His business interests, sorry, I forgot about those, absolutely doted on trains and brought the line to Denbigh. he and Squire Griffiths of Caerheen, which is near where I live, financed it, and the problem was getting enough money to get it going. I don't think it ever paid, but it worked, and of course, did it come through Rutland?
Yes.
Yes, that line, and then St Asaph and Trevena. Yes. Trevena was a station, wasn't it?
Cardwen, yes.
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 And then on to...
Until the Worrid Bridge was built.
Yes.
And then the railway closed.
I know. So, he also was very interested in farming, as I said. He had a soda water company in Ruthin and a hematite mine at Woodbury, which was an amazing thing, really. I didn't know about this until fairly recently. I don't remember my father ever talking about it, but there is a photograph of that. And apparently the boys, my father's family now, that generation, used to take the wages on they used to cycle over from Denbigh to Woodbury on a Saturday morning with the men's wages. Because of course they had to work on Saturdays then. So he had a lot of business interests, and I think was a very, very conscientious and very hard-working man. He died of a heart attack at the age of 83 when he was writing his biography of Gladstone, and he was only ill for 2 days, had an enormous funeral, and people of all denominations came. He was very open-minded in had strong beliefs, but he was also tolerant of other people's beliefs, and I think that's something that's worth saying. The building passed out of our family because my father was actually supposed to be taking it over. His father had died young, Howell, son of Thomas G. And my father went to Bangor University and was studying English and Welsh and was hoping to be a journalist. And he then was called up for the First World War, and his mother wrote and said, what do you want to do when you get back? And he said, if I get back alive, I want an outdoor life. And so they sold the press then, and to be quite honest, it was apparently the end of the golden age of Welsh publishing. There was so much competition from then on in printing and publishing, and a lot of English books, and they struggled. I had heard quite a lot about it from other people who were involved in the 40s and 50s and so on, and then of course it was very famously run by Kate Roberts, and sort of held on, and then the last owner, Mr. Emlyn Evans, eventually sold it at the year of the Eisteddfod in Denbigh, 2001. And this little book over here, which was produced for the Eisteddfod by me, because we felt we wanted to have something. It's a bilingual, and it was the last thing that was published in Gwas G, which was rather sad. But since then, the building has been empty, and of course buildings don't improve, do they, as they stand empty, and it's still watertight. The council has spent considerable amounts of money on making sure that it doesn't collapse. I'm chairman of the Buildings Preservation Trust of Gwas G, and we have very, very helpful and faithful trustees. We've been at it now since trying just to get the ownership of the building, to be honest, because we can't do anything until we have the building. If we owned the building, the trust could probably get enough money to get started with the museum. It's a fantastic... I know, it's a very sad story really, because it's a grade 2 star listed building. It's huge, very, very interesting, unique. There isn't another like it in Wales, and I have got some pictures of other museums of printing, but they're very few and far between. We just feel it would be a wonderful thing if we could find a good reuse of the building to show people, you know, about printing, which is already becoming historic, isn't it, as a you know, an art form or whatever. I mean, nothing is printed now in the same way as this, and with everything, e-books and everything else, it's it's going to have even more significance, you would think. And people love to. We had a session one day. There's a little hand press in the. I should say that we bought, in case anything happened to the building, we bought the contents of the compositors' room. Very interesting room, huge, very well lit, presses, trays, compositors' trays, tons of type. I mean, it's all there ready to just make into a show, you know. And we had to go with one of our trustees is a retired printer, and he got going with a little hand press, and we turned out our names, and you know, you could imagine what fun it would be for children, really, just to get going with bookmarks or labels or whatever. So I do hope that will be one use. We also have there's a Thomas G archive in the National Library and in Ruthin. We have a lot of stuff in the family. I've got dresses, the wedding dress, and I've got the dress that this portrait was painted in. Not that it's very exciting, but it's interesting to people who are interested in old fashions in very good state of repair. It's a brown brocade. Lots of other things. Portraits we've got. So these could all be there. Because he has actually not been forgotten. There have been two biographies written, the one I mentioned, T. Gwyn Jones, and also Ieuan Wyn Jones's one as well in Welsh. Both of them are in Welsh. Every year in Sunday school, the medals are given. Some of you will perhaps know about Medalau G, where the ministers put forward the names of their most worthy members of the Sunday school. I've got a little collection here of photographs. This was done by the children after their mother died. She died after her husband, and they printed off the golden wedding photograph of the pair of them, which I've got here somewhere hidden. They printed off these medals, and originally there were only 8 of them given. And then over the years, well, this year we presented in Trevenant, we presented 22. And it used to be done, it's always been done by members of the family. There are many descendants of Thomas G, but I think I'm the only one living in Wales, and it means that sometimes, rather too often, it probably falls on me. But not that it's a wonderful occasion, don't get me wrong, it's a lovely thing to be at. But it's nice for the people, to see somebody different. And this year we had a lovely doctor from Canada who flew over and presented the medals, and was there for about 2 days, and then flew back again. And she said it was one of the best experiences of her life. So that was good. And so he's not forgotten. He was offered a peerage, but he refused. Not a peerage. Yes, a peerage. Yeah, a peerage. But he refused that. He was a very humble person. I hope I've given you some sort of idea of the person he was. And to go back to the museum, we feel that it's worthy. It would be a worthy memorial if we could get it going. We could show not just G stuff. Denbigh's got a huge history. There could be rooms for different things, different topics. We could have different exhibitions on show, other things of interest. So. I think probably, I've got some stuff to show you if you want to come up and see it. I've also got the books, I charge £2 for the books, which are just a short history, and they've got some photographs in. And the other thing is, I'm just mentioning this in passing, we do have a Friends Association, but because we're moving so slowly with progress, there's not a great deal to report to the Friends. We are hoping at the next Eisteddfod, next year, which is in Denbigh again, to do something special for that in the way of an exhibition, and just to remind people again about what we're trying to do with the building. It's a bad time, you know, it's just a bad time, isn't it? Councils don't have much money, and it's just very frustrating.
Is there no lottery funding?
Yes, there would be funding once we get the ownership, you see, and the council would help. And we've got the Prince's Trust. One of our trustees works for the Prince, and they are very interested. The Prince's Regeneration Trust would help us. So, but then they've got the running of it. So we would have to sublet part of the building, possibly to, you know, for some other purpose, perhaps nothing to do with the museum, because it's very, very big. You'd be surprised how big it is inside. The compositors' room is just as though they've gone out for a cup of coffee. It is amazing, really.
We went round Open Doors. We went round
Did
into
you go?
Open Doors
Right.
a few years ago, so it is absolutely amazing. It's
It is,
wonderful.
isn't
And it'd be a terrible shame if anything happened to it. It's got to be kept.
I know.
It really
Who has actually
has.
got ownership of it then?
Pardon?
Who has actually got ownership
Well,
of it?
it belongs to Mr. Emlyn Evans,
Oh, right, so
who was
he
the
hasn't
last
sold it off.
publisher.
Right.
Yes, he was the last publisher there.
So,
Yes.
so
And-
he's
and-
against selling it, is he?
Well, I suppose we have to look at it from his point of view. He sees it as a source of income, you know, as a and I mean you can. The point is now it has sort of negative value really because we'd have to
really?
spend so much
Yeah.
on it. Well, we have tried to negotiate obviously in the past, but now I don't know. It's very difficult because I don't think it has. You know, it's just got. It needs so much doing to it really.
Well, what if he kept it and then it was just done in his, you know, ownership, but it was then gone into Prince's Trust and lottery fund and everything through him, that way round. He won't do it.
No, we've tried to.
He'd rather let it fall down, would he?
Well, I think, you see, that's, sadly, we know that's what happens to buildings, and then they have a valuable site.
Yeah, they can build houses on. So he'd rather it
Well,
fell down.
About 4 years ago, there was a planning application for 11 flats, and we opposed that, and that wasn't carried. We were successful in opposing it, is what I'm trying to say. Partly because there were bats there.
You haven't found newts as well, have you?
I dare say you can
I
manage
bet
to
you'll
build
find
it.
some newts there.
Are they buried in Denbigh at all?
Yes, he's got a huge
In where?
in the cemetery.
In Islyn? When?
Cemetery. Yeah, non-conformist, you see. Yes.
Where's that cemetery then?
Ustred Road.
Oh
That's
yes,
it.
oh yes,
And,
I'm okay. Yeah, all
You
right.
know, and
Yes.
it's a very, it's quite an extraordinary build. It is a build. It's about from here to there, like that, and then it goes up and up.
All right.
You can't
Find the
miss it.
cemetery, you won't miss it.
Yeah, that's right. And his wife and one of his daughters. Yes.
I can see Emlyn's, another Emlyn Evans, but not the one you've been telling us about, has got something to
Oh right.
to ask you about.
I have here you mentioned the Medal G.
Yes.
I have here when issued by the Welsh Presbyterian Church. This was 2003 and the other was this year's in Trefnant, which
That's
you
right.
mentioned. And there is a...
That's the golden
Picture.
wedding photograph.
Oh, lovely.
Is that what it is?
Yes, it is.
You know, it brings it home to you, really, I think. And here the medal
That's right.
on the front
Oh,
of it,
yes,
which you mentioned.
thank you.
Yes, I thought I'd mention it.
Yes, thank you
because,
very much.
To sort of complete the picture.
Yes, yes. The golden wedding was a great occasion. Really, I got an illuminated address from the council. He was the first chairman of Denbigh County Council, yeah, which is slightly ironic. And he, I think this year I've been to. Well, I've been married 54 years, but my friends. I think we've been to about 4 garden do's in the last year.
Yeah.
So, but in their day, they had special gifts. You know, I've got inkwells, little inkwells with a silver top and the initials on. And these were all presents for that occasion because it was so rare. People just didn't live that long, did they? No, it's so very interesting.
Yes. Well, we're 53. 54 this next year. Yes.
Yes.
Well, thank you. That was fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. Are there any more questions before we have a cup of tea? Yes, Mike?
Since he was a man of such talent and so many interests and a moral commitment to society as a whole, I'm surprised that he resisted the approach to go to Parliament, shall we say.
Yes, I know. I think
where was the conflict?
the conflict was that, firstly, I think he'd have to go away a lot. He was on. He was chairman of so many local things as well. You see, he was preaching, hospital visiting. He was chairman of the county council. He was involved with temperance.
It's a time commitment, isn't
I know.
It sounds awfully familiar.
Yes, yes, exactly. But also, I think he felt his influence was through the paper.
Yes.
You know, he was able to do a huge amount. There was no competition, you see, with the paper.
No.
Things he worked through through these younger MPs, and he really was the man that set Lloyd George. You know, he had a lot of good publicity from the paper and support. Yeah, I think they were. That was probably the answer. He was also a great family man. You see, you know, he had children and grandchildren.
That's great.
You know.
Sounds good. I like the sound of him very, very much.
Yeah, I think people did like him.
Yes.
A lot. Yes.
Anything? I love the name of the horse, the Dego.
Oh, the Dego.
Yes, yes. Because you were mentioning tithes. We all know that the tithe was 1/10 of your income, wasn't it, to the church? And it's a heck of a lot of money to pay over.
Especially if you didn't go to that church.
Yes, absolutely.
That was what the rub was.
Yes.
You see, they were all contributing to their new chapels, building them and supporting them. And yes, I mean, I think that we forget now that the clergy had often went there, and certainly were not Welsh speak. You know, there were lots of problems, weren't there, and which we're not familiar with. Oh, thank you very much. I'm afraid I don't have any change yet.
Get some going now. If anybody wants a booklet,
Is anyone coming
Yes.
to make tea with them?
yes. Can we have a tea maker? Because we haven't got anybody. Sit
Well,
down.
I'll give round.
I want to.
Right, okay, well, hang on till I get
Yes.
some change.
Okay, we'll get some change.
No,
I put